Next to the polarizing filter, a variable neutral density filter is the filter I most often have in my camera bag. In this video, I'll cover the situations I use the variable neutral density filter in landscape photography, and I'll also go over how to use it in practice. A neutral density filter reduces the amount of light hitting the sensor without altering the color at all. I use one when I need the shutter speed to be slow, but due to the lighting conditions, I'm having to use a higher shutter speed than I would like to get the correct exposure. The most common scenarios I would want to slow down the shutter speed are to blur water or clouds in a landscape to make the image more evocative and dreamlike, to make light streaks from vehicles in motion, to blur people in a scene to give a sense of movement, to create a panning effect where the subject is sharp but the background has motion blur, to allow me to paint with light with a torch or a light brush. Also, if I'm photographing in bright sunlight with a very wide aperture, which lets a lot of light in, and I need to slow the shutter speed. In fact, for whatever reason you need to slow your shutter speed down, and you've reached the limits of adjusting aperture or ISO to achieve this, the solution will be to use a neutral density filter. So let's go through the techniques and tricks for each of the scenarios where I would most likely use a neutral density filter. So blurring water or clouds, simply choose a shutter speed for the required amount of blurring. You may need to experiment a bit with this, but a rule of thumb is if you want to see a bit of texture in moving water, you will need to choose a shutter speed below about 5 seconds. Anything beyond 30 seconds should give you silky smooth water, and moving clouds will have softened. You can see in these examples the effect of shutter speed on the end result. Light streaks from vehicles. I find the best time to take these shots is twilight, when you've got just enough ambient light to give some detail to the environment. The problem with doing these shots during hours of darkness is the environment can just go a textureless black, which is not that appealing. But there is a trick you can use if you have time to hang around from twilight to complete darkness. I use it in this image here, where it took about 90 seconds for the car to drive the stretch of road and give me the red streak of light from the tail lights. This was really the only way I could accomplish this shot, because at twilight the image would have been overexposed at 90 seconds, and using a neutral density filter would have darkened the taillights too much. I took the twilight shot without any vehicle first at dusk, and then about 45 minutes later took the 90-second shot of the vehicle driving along the road. Because I left the camera on a tripod, the images are in perfect registration, so all I had to do was drop them into Photoshop as layers with the dark layer on top. Then change the opacity mode of this layer to lighten, and I have my shot. We will use this technique again later by using a torch to paint with light. Blurring people in a scene. This is quite effective when you want to give a sense of motion in a photograph. You need to experiment with shutter speeds, but I find anything between a 15th and 5 seconds as a starting point can give quite good results. Panning. Now, this technique's been around for quite a while, but it's still really useful. Basically, you follow the subject with your camera, usually in a horizontal motion, while keeping the shutter speed low enough to blur the background, but high enough to keep the subject reasonably sharp. You can combine this with a flash to further freeze the subject. The painting with light. This is where you use a torch or some sort of light source to move around and light the subject while keeping the shutter speed slow enough to record those brush strokes of light. So like the car light scenario, this is also best done at twilight and can be more effective by combining multiple exposures in post-production. So here is an example. I've taken 3 shots to combine in Photoshop. The first image is taken at dusk to get the ambient light, then 2 long exposures have been taken later when it's darker, and I can see the effect of moving the torch over the subject. Because I've taken the shots on a tripod, it's fairly straightforward to layer the images in Photoshop with the ambient light layer on the background, and then set the light brushing layers to lighten and mask out the unwanted areas if you need to. This technique opens up a lot of additional control. For example, if you've loaded the layers as smart raw files, you have a lot of flexibility to adjust the color and tone of the layers to get a different end result. Another use scenario for neutral density filters is when you're photographing in bright sunlight, and typically this would be if I were taking portraits and wanted to use a very wide aperture for a blurry background. Also, if you're using flash outdoors in these bright situations, you often need to keep the shutter speed below 1/250th of a second, as many flashes won't synchronize with the camera above this shutter speed. Now, getting creative with Photoshop layers, I thought I'd give a bit of background to this image because it combines long exposure photography with flash photography. As with many techniques, you need to understand Photoshop layers and masks. And if there's one thing I'd recommend getting your head around in Photoshop, it is layers and masking. It just opens up so many possibilities. I got the idea for doing a portrait here after taking these shots. So here are the 3 images I created on the day that are meant to go together to tell a story. So a little bit about the subject. Stefan Roberts is a pinhole camera enthusiast, and he has spent years developing his techniques and creating beautiful artworks. And it's a wonderfully organic way of working this pinhole camera photography thing, and a great antithesis to the digital world. I recommend checking his work out online as it's really interesting, and I've included a link in the description. The technique behind these images is not that complicated. It involves leaving the camera on a tripod so that all the shots you take are in registration, then taking the long exposure shot and then the flash exposure shot to light and freeze the portrait, then stacking the exposures in layers in Photoshop and using layer masks to hide or reveal the parts that you want or don't want. The traditional neutral density filter is simply the screw-on type and is at a fixed density. But lately I've been favoring these variable in neutral density filters. When they first came out, they were very expensive and the quality wasn't that great, but these days the quality is superb and they're quite economical. The other system I use, especially when I require a lot of neutral density filtration, is this system by NISI. It's quite bulky and a bit slow to use, but the quality is really good. And another advantage is that I can use a polarizing filter in combination with the neutral density filters, which is quite useful, especially when you're photographing things like waterfalls and dense bush. One thing I do need to be careful about when I'm using it is the really dense neutral density filters that come with it are a bit prone to light leaking with very long exposures, so I have to make sure that the filter is properly lined up in the filter holder. Another thing that I don't like about it is they don't come with a lens hood to shade the sun from hitting the filters. So I've actually made up my own lens hood, but it'd be great if they actually made one that came with the kit. I would say that if you're looking to purchase neutral density filters, do some research first and get what suits your needs, because I purchased mine a few years ago, and while they're ample for my needs, there's a bewildering array of quality options out there these days, including these ones from Case, which clip on over your sensor. Provided you're careful not to damage your sensor, they have the advantage of working with any lens size, even those lenses without a front filter thread. So even though they're not variable, they're small and light, and I could see myself working with these in the future. Especially if you're like me and you've got quite a lot of lenses, many of which don't have a front filter thread. So you can get graduated neutral density filters, and this is where one end of the filter is clear and one end is dark on the other, with a gradation in the middle. I don't use these as I find it more effective these days to do this sort of exposure adjustment in post-production. And here you can see I've simulated the filter in action over a scene. So you move the filter physically up or down to line it up with where you want that gradation to be, usually along the horizon line. The advantage of doing this sort of technique in post-production is that you can be more precise when you're lining up the transition line, and the line doesn't even have to be a straight line. It can follow the contour of a hill or a mountain. So some other things to consider. Working out correct exposure. I can use the histogram on the back of my Sony camera to work out exposure up to 30 seconds, but beyond that I need to do some calculations or use a phone app, such as the one provided by NISI or the more in-depth Photopills version that gives some useful starting points and different shooting scenarios. Filter rating systems. It's quite confusing that there are 4 commonly used neutral density measures for specifying the amount of exposure reduction. I've listed the 4 different systems on screen for your reference. I tend to think in stops of light, so I'm always relating the numbering systems back to the stops of light that the filter is reducing. And 2 other essential items. Except when panning an image, I nearly always use a tripod and a remote release dealing with slow shutter speeds. These are essential for avoiding camera shake, which can introduce unintended blurring. Of course, you can use a built-in self-timer in a camera if you have one. Be aware also that if you're using a DSLR camera, you may need to activate the mirror lockup function, as with slow shutter speeds, the act of the mirror coming up may produce vibrations in the camera and also blur your shots. There are many reasons when you want to control the shutter speed, and I've covered the ones that I commonly use, and you may well have others. You don't always have to use an ND filter to slow the shutter speed, and in fact, in many of these examples, I haven't used an ND filter, but it is handy to have one if you're doing long exposure photography, because there are times when you will need it. The one thing I would like to say is there are no hard and fast rules in any of this. Photography is personal and subjective, but it is also a technical art, and often the chosen shutter speed can completely change the mood of an image. And to achieve this, you'll often need a neutral density filter.